A woman hugs her son in 1931, but zooming in on the boy's face, something feels off. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully examined the old photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian's archives that morning. The black and white image, dated 1931, showed a tender moment. A woman in a simple cotton dress embracing a young boy of perhaps 8 years old. They stood in front of what appeared to be a modest farmhouse somewhere in rural Kansas, based on the flat horizon and wooden fence visible in the background. Just another Depression-era family photo, Margaret murmured to herself, noting the woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothing that told the story of those difficult times. The photograph had been donated by the estate of Eleanor Hartwell, along with dozens of other family memorabilia from the early 20th century. But as Margaret reached for her magnifying glass to examine the photograph's condition for archival purposes, something made her pause. The woman's face showed genuine maternal love, her arms wrapped protectively around the child. Her expression was soft, caring, exactly what you'd expect from a mother holding her son. The boy, however, was different. Margaret leaned closer, her breath catching slightly. While the woman gazed down at the child with unmistakable affection, the boy's eyes seemed to stare straight ahead with an intensity that felt unsettling for someone so young. His small hands, which should have been relaxed in his mother's embrace, appeared rigid at his sides. "That's odd," she whispered, adjusting the desk lamp to get better lighting on the photograph. The more she studied the boy's face, the more uncomfortable she became. There was something in his expression, not the innocent wonder of childhood, but something else entirely. Something that seemed far too mature, too calculated for an 8-year-old child in 1931. Margaret made a note in her research log. Unusual family photograph. Recommend further investigation into the Hartwell family history. She had no way of knowing that this single photograph would unravel a mystery that had remained hidden for over 90 years, changing everything she thought she knew about the power of a mother's love and the secrets that families keep buried in plain sight. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving through the winding roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, toward the sprawling Victorian house that had belonged to Eleanor Hartwell. The elderly woman had passed away at 97, leaving behind a meticulously organized estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield as someone who had lived quietly but purposefully. Eleanor's great-niece, Sarah Morrison, met Margaret at the front door. Sarah was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She worked as a librarian in Philadelphia, but had taken time off to handle her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleanor's collection," Sarah said, as she led Margaret through rooms filled with carefully preserved furniture and photographs. She was passionate about family history, though she was always quite private about certain aspects of our family's past. The house felt like stepping back in time. Hardwood floors creaked under their feet as they walked past walls lined with family portraits spanning several generations. Margaret noticed that many of the photographs were professionally mounted and labeled with Eleanor's neat handwriting. She never married or had children of her own, Sarah explained, but she devoted her life to preserving our family's story. She used to say that photographs were windows into souls, that they revealed truths that people might prefer to keep hidden. They reached Eleanor's study, a cozy room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk covered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and research notes. Sarah picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said, handing it to Margaret. "Aunt Eleanor's research notes about the 1931 photograph you mentioned on the phone. She spent years trying to understand that particular image." Margaret opened the journal carefully. Eleanor's handwriting filled the pages with dates, observations, and questions. One entry immediately caught her attention. "The boy in mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never understood? The truth about Thomas must be somewhere in these photographs." Thomas. Margaret looked up at Sarah. "Who was Thomas?" Sarah's expression grew troubled. "That's just it. We are not entirely sure." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee from an old percolator in Eleanor's kitchen, while Margaret spread several photographs across the wooden table. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the images. "What I'm about to tell you might sound strange," Sarah began, settling into her chair. "Growing up, I heard whispered conversations among the older family members about a boy named Thomas who lived with my great-grandmother Ruth Hartwell in the early 1930s. But the stories never quite matched up." She pointed to the 1931 photograph that had started Margaret's investigation. Some relatives insisted this was Ruth's son, Thomas, who died young of influenza. Others claimed he wasn't her biological son at all, but a child she was caring for temporarily. A few family members even suggested that Thomas never existed, that the photograph showed a different child entirely. Margaret studied the image again, noting the boy's peculiar expression. What did Eleanor believe? That's what makes this so intriguing, Sarah replied, pulling out another photograph from a manila envelope. Aunt Eleanor found this last year while going through some papers in the attic. The second photograph, also from 1931, but taken several months later based on the seasonal clothing, showed the same woman, Ruth Hartwell, standing alone in front of the farmhouse. She appeared tired, almost haunted, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Most notably, there was no sign of the boy. "Look at the back," Sarah urged. Margaret carefully turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Left? But your family members said he died of influenza." "Exactly," Sarah said grimly. "That's when Aunt Eleanor realized that our family had been keeping secrets for nearly a century. She became obsessed with finding out the truth about Thomas, who he really was, where he came from, and most importantly, what happened to him." Margaret pulled out her notebook. "Did Eleanor discover anything else?" Sarah hesitated before reaching for a third photograph. She found this hidden behind the frame of an old mirror in the attic. It's dated 2 weeks before the first photograph was taken. This image showed Ruth Hartwell with a completely different boy, one with lighter hair and a genuine smile. The resemblance between Ruth and this second child was unmistakable. "This," Sarah said quietly, "was Ruth's actual son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this photograph was taken." Margaret returned to Washington, D.C. with copies of all 3 photographs and Eleanor's research notes, her mind racing with questions. The next morning, she reached out to Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who specialized in photographic authentication and historical document analysis. "I need you to examine these images very carefully," she told James, as they met in his laboratory at Georgetown University. "I want to know everything, the paper, the chemicals used in developing, any signs of tampering or manipulation." James was a meticulous researcher in his mid-50s who had helped solve several historical mysteries through his detailed analysis of photographs and documents. He placed the first photograph under a high-powered digital microscope connected to a computer monitor. "Interesting," he murmured after several minutes of examination. "The photograph is definitely authentic. The paper and chemical composition are consistent with 1931 photography techniques. But there's something unusual about the image quality." Margaret leaned closer to look at the monitor. "What do you mean? See this area around the boy's face?" James pointed to the screen where the image was magnified several times. "The grain structure is slightly different. It's subtle, but it suggests that this portion of the photograph may have been subject to some kind of additional processing or exposure." He switched to the second photograph, Ruth standing alone. "This image shows no such irregularities. It's a straightforward photograph taken with standard equipment of the era." But when James examined the third photograph, Ruth with her biological son James, he made a discovery that changed everything. "Margaret, you need to see this," he said, his voice filled with excitement. He had overlaid the 2 images on his computer screen, adjusting for slight differences in positioning and lighting. "Look at the background elements, the fence posts, the shadows, the positioning of the farmhouse." Margaret stared at the screen. The backgrounds were nearly identical, suggesting the photographs had been taken from almost exactly the same spot. "But more importantly," James continued, "look at this." He zoomed in on Ruth's dress in both photographs. "See this small tear in the fabric near her left shoulder? It's visible in both images. And here, this scuff mark on her shoe." These photographs were taken much closer together in time than the dates suggest. Margaret felt her heart racing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that based on the physical evidence, Ruth's clothing, the lighting conditions, even the way her hair is arranged, these photographs were likely taken on the same day, possibly within hours of each other." Armed with this new information, Margaret decided to travel to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwell family had lived in 1931. The small farming community, now with a population of fewer than 2,000 people, still maintained records from the Depression era in its modest town hall. Mary Kowalski, the town clerk, was a woman in her 70s who had lived in Millfield her entire life. Her grandfather had been the town's doctor during the 1930s, and she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local families and their histories. Ruth Hartwell, Mary said thoughtfully as she pulled out several dusty record books. Oh yes, I remember the stories about her. My grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Sweet boy, but sickly from birth, died of pneumonia in the winter of 1931, broke poor Ruth's heart. Margaret showed Mary the photographs. The elderly woman studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. This is definitely Ruth, she said, pointing to the woman in the images. And this boy, she indicated the photograph of Ruth with James, looks just like the Hartwell family. James had that same sandy hair and gentle expression as his father. But when Mary looked at the photograph of Ruth with the dark-haired boy, the image that had started Margaret's investigation, her face grew troubled. This child, I don't recognize him at all, and I knew every family in this area during the Depression. We all looked out for each other's children. She paused, studying the boy's face more intently. There's something about his eyes that's quite unsettling, almost like he's much older than he appears. Mary walked to a filing cabinet and retrieved a folder marked 1931 Birth and Death Records. James Hartwell died on February 15th, 1931, she confirmed, running her finger down a handwritten list. But here's what's strange. There's no record of any other child living with Ruth that year. No adoption papers, no temporary custody arrangements, nothing. She looked up at Margaret with concern. According to our official records, after James died, Ruth Hartwell lived alone on that farm until she moved to Pennsylvania in late 1931. Yet you're showing me photographs that suggest otherwise. Margaret felt a chill. Is there anyone else in town who might remember those days? Mary thought for a moment. Frank Morrison. He's 94 now and lives at the assisted living facility. His family owned the farm next to the Hartwells. If anyone would remember a strange boy living with Ruth, it would be Frank. The Millfield Assisted Living Center was a modest, well-maintained facility on the outskirts of town. Frank Morrison sat in his wheelchair by a large window overlooking a garden, his mind still sharp despite his advanced age. When Margaret showed him the photographs, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Dear God," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he held the image of Ruth with the dark-haired boy. "I never thought I'd see that child's face again." Margaret pulled up a chair beside him. "You remember this boy?" Frank nodded slowly. "Thomas. That's what Ruth called him, though I always suspected that wasn't his real name. He appeared at Ruth's farm shortly after young James died, maybe a week or two later. Ruth was nearly mad with grief, and suddenly there was this boy. Where did he come from? That's just it. Nobody knew for certain. Ruth claimed she was caring for him temporarily, that his family was going through hard times. But the boy?" Frank paused, his eyes distant with memory. There was something deeply wrong with that child. Frank described how Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, his words seemed too sophisticated for his apparent age. The boy would stare at people with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable, and he seemed to know things he shouldn't. Details about neighbors' private lives, information about events that had happened before he supposedly arrived in Millfield. "The animals didn't like him," Frank continued. "My family's dog would whimper and hide whenever Thomas was around. Even Ruth's old milk cow would become agitated when he approached. Animals sense things, you know." Margaret showed Frank the photograph of Ruth standing alone. "What happened to Thomas?" Frank's expression grew dark. "He disappeared one night in late summer, 1931. Ruth never spoke of it, but the next morning she was different, relieved, but also haunted. She moved away within a few months and never returned to Millfield. Did anyone report him missing?" "That's the strangest part," Frank said. "Nobody seemed to care that he was gone. It was as if the entire town collectively decided to forget he had ever existed. Even Ruth acted as though he had never been there at all." Frank leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll tell you something I've never told another living soul. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was walking past Ruth's farm and I saw her in the backyard, digging. She was digging deep into the ground behind the barn, working through the night by lantern light." Margaret contacted Sarah Morrison immediately after her conversation with Frank. Together, they drove to Kansas to locate the original Hartwell farm, which had been abandoned since the 1950s, but still stood on what was now agricultural land owned by a local farming corporation. The current landowner, Robert Jensen, was a practical man in his 60s who had grown up hearing stories about the cursed Hartwell place. He readily gave them permission to explore the property, even providing them with ground-penetrating radar equipment he used for checking irrigation lines. The farmhouse was in ruins. Its roof had collapsed years ago, and weather had worn away much of the wooden siding, but the stone foundation remained intact, and the old barn Frank had mentioned still stood, though its red paint had long since faded to a rusty brown. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning walking the property, trying to match the photographs with the current landscape. Despite decades of neglect, they were able to identify the exact spot where Ruth had posed with both boys, a slight rise in the ground that provided a clear view of the house. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn, Margaret reminded Sarah as they approached the weathered structure. The area behind the barn was overgrown with tall grass and weeds, but the ground-penetrating radar would be able to detect any disturbances in the soil. Robert Jensen arrived with his equipment around noon. The radar unit looked like a large lawnmower with a display screen that showed underground features. As he slowly moved the device across the area behind the barn, Margaret and Sarah watched the screen intently. "There," Robert said suddenly, stopping the machine. "Something's definitely buried here. Looks like it's about 4 feet down, roughly rectangular shape." Margaret felt her heart racing. "How big?" Robert studied the screen. "About the size of a large suitcase, or—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Well, it could be a small casket." Sarah gripped Margaret's arm. "You don't think—" "There's only one way to find out," Margaret replied grimly. "We need to call the local sheriff's department. If there's any possibility that human remains are buried here, this needs to be handled properly." As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover a truth that the Hartwell family, and perhaps the entire town of Millfield, had been trying to forget for 90 years. The wind picked up across the abandoned farm, whistling through the broken windows of the farmhouse and rustling the tall grass. In that sound, Margaret almost imagined she could hear the echo of a child's voice, not the innocent laughter of a young boy, but something far more unsettling. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within an hour, accompanied by the county coroner and a forensic team from the state police. As a veteran law enforcement officer, Martinez had seen his share of unusual cases, but the possibility of investigating a 90-year-old potential crime scene was unprecedented in his experience. "We need to be extremely careful here," Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist, explained as her team prepared their equipment. "If there are human remains, they'll be fragile after all this time. And if this is somehow connected to a crime, we need to preserve any evidence that might still exist." The excavation began slowly, with the team removing layers of soil by hand once they reached the depth indicated by the ground-penetrating radar. Margaret and Sarah watched from a distance, both nervous and fascinated by the methodical process. After 2 hours of careful digging, one of the forensic technicians called out, "I've got something." Dr. Chen knelt beside the excavation site and used a soft brush to carefully clear dirt from what appeared to be a corner of something wooden. As more soil was removed, the outline of a small handmade wooden box became visible, roughly the size of a child's coffin, but clearly constructed by amateur hands. "This wasn't made by a professional carpenter," Dr. Chen observed, noting the uneven joints and crude construction. "Someone built this quickly, probably under stressful circumstances." Sheriff Martinez documented everything with photographs as the box was carefully lifted from the ground. It was secured with a simple latch, weathered but still intact after decades underground. "Before we open this, I want everyone to understand the gravity of what we might find," the sheriff announced. "If these are human remains, we're potentially looking at evidence of a crime that occurred in 1931. Everything must be handled according to proper forensic protocols." Dr. Chen carefully opened the latch. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been a white cloth but was now stained brown with age, were the unmistakable remains of a small human skeleton. But as she gently moved the cloth aside, her expression changed from professional concentration to confusion. "This is unusual," she said, looking up at the gathered group. "These bones show evidence of abnormal development. The skull structure suggests this individual was much older than the size would indicate, possibly an adult with severe developmental abnormalities, or—" She paused, studying the remains more carefully with a magnifying glass. "Or what?" Sheriff Martinez asked. "I've never seen anything quite like this. The bone density and structure suggest someone who was chronologically much older than their physical size would indicate. And look at this." Dr. Chen pointed to the skull. Even Margaret and Sarah could see that the dental structure was completely wrong for a child. The teeth were adult teeth, but in a skull that appeared to belong to someone much younger. While the forensic team continued their analysis of the remains, Margaret received a call from James Patterson back at Georgetown University. His investigation into the photographs had yielded a breakthrough that shed new light on their discovery. "Margaret, I've been researching historical medical conditions that might explain what you've found," James said over the phone. "Based on your description of the skeletal remains, I think we might be dealing with a case of progeria, or a similar premature aging syndrome." Margaret was unfamiliar with the condition. James explained that progeria was an extremely rare genetic disorder that caused rapid aging in children, typically resulting in the physical appearance of an elderly person in a child's body. In 1931, medical understanding of such conditions was virtually non-existent. "But here's what's really interesting," James continued. "I found records of a medical case study from 1930 involving a child named Timothy Walsh, who disappeared from a state facility in Nebraska. The boy suffered from an advanced form of progeria and displayed behavioral abnormalities that made him difficult to manage in institutional settings." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. What kind of behavioral abnormalities? According to the medical records, Timothy appeared to possess the mental capacity and emotional complexity of an adult trapped in a child's deteriorating body. The combination of his physical appearance and advanced psychological development made him profoundly disturbing to those around him. He was described as manipulative, calculating, and capable of understanding and exploiting adult emotions in ways that seemed supernatural to people in the 1930s. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized that what Ruth Hartwell had experienced wasn't supernatural at all, but a tragic encounter with a child suffering from an extremely rare medical condition that wouldn't be properly understood for decades. "James, can you send me copies of those medical records? I think Timothy Walsh and the boy known as Thomas might be the same person." After hanging up, Margaret shared this information with Sarah. The revelation reframed everything they had discovered. Ruth Hartwell hadn't been dealing with something supernatural, but with a profoundly ill child whose condition made him appear otherworldly to people in 1931. "So Thomas, or Timothy, died of his condition while staying with Ruth?" Sarah asked. "It seems likely," Margaret replied. "Ruth was probably caring for him out of compassion, but when he died, she panicked. In 1931, people didn't understand progeria. If authorities had found his body, they might have suspected Ruth of harming him, or worse, thought something supernatural had occurred." Margaret paused, looking at the excavation site where the forensic team was still working. Ruth buried him in secret to protect herself, but also to give him the dignity of a proper burial that he probably never would have received otherwise. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in Eleanor Hartwell's study with Sarah, having spent days piecing together the complete story from medical records, town documents, and Eleanor's meticulous research notes. The mystery that had begun with a single unsettling photograph had revealed a deeply human story of compassion, tragedy, and the lengths one woman went to protect both herself and a suffering child. The forensic analysis had confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child approximately 10 years old chronologically, but with the bone development and dental structure of someone much older. DNA testing, while limited given the age of the remains, had been compared with samples from the Walsh family in Nebraska, strongly suggesting that Thomas was indeed Timothy Walsh. "Eleanor suspected the truth," Sarah said, reading from her great-aunt's final research notes. "Look at this entry from last year. Ruth saved that poor boy from a lifetime of institutional horror. When his suffering ended, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great personal risk to herself." Margaret had arranged for Timothy Walsh to be reburied in the Millfield Cemetery with a proper headstone. The inscription, approved by both the Walsh descendants in Nebraska and the Hartwell family, read simply, "Timothy Walsh, 1920-1931. A child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace." The 1931 photograph now made perfect sense. Ruth's maternal love was genuine. She had been caring for a desperately ill child who had nowhere else to go. Timothy's unsettling expression wasn't malevolent, but reflected the profound confusion and pain of a child trapped in a rapidly aging body, possessing adult awareness in an impossible situation. Ruth was a hero, Margaret concluded, looking at the photograph one final time. In an era when people would have been terrified of Timothy's condition, she saw past his appearance to the suffering child underneath. She gave him comfort in his final months and dignity in death. The story had revealed something beautiful about human compassion, but also highlighted how fear of the unknown could force good people into desperate situations. Ruth Hartwell had carried the secret of her kindness for decades, unable to speak about the act of mercy that had defined her life. Margaret carefully placed the photograph in an archival preservation sleeve. It would be donated to the Smithsonian's collection, but now it would be displayed with the full story, not as a mystery, but as a testament to the power of human kindness in the face of the incomprehensible. The boy's face no longer seemed unsettling to Margaret. Instead, she saw what Ruth had seen, a child who needed love, care, and ultimately, the dignity of being remembered not for his strange appearance, but for the compassion he inspired in others. In the end, the photograph had revealed its truth. Sometimes what feels off is simply something we don't yet understand, and sometimes the most beautiful stories are hidden behind the most troubling images.